Please watch Part 1 for a better understanding of this. Chapter 15. Shadows of the Crimson Phoenix. The air in Longshan had grown tense as the case involving the murders of 10 children took center stage. Su Ming, reluctant as always to involve himself in active investigations, had no choice but to be drawn in. His father, Chief Su, was heading the case, but despite his years of experience and the efforts of the entire police force, no leads had emerged. This case had shaken the nation, and Su Ming could no longer ignore the pull. Sitting in his study, Su Ming casually scrolled through police reports, press releases, and surveillance footage. His genius mind, though lazy, was always working in the background, connecting dots most people wouldn't even see. The details of the case felt familiar, like pieces of a puzzle he had solved 1,000 times over in his previous life as the god of criminals. But this wasn't some run-of-the-mill investigation. It was far deeper. His attention was drawn to a name that had surfaced multiple times in the investigation: Crimson Phoenix Syndicate. The Crimson Phoenix Syndicate was a notorious criminal organization whose presence loomed over Dragon Country like an ominous cloud. They were experts at keeping themselves in the shadows, but their reach was undeniable. Known for human trafficking, contract killings, drug trade, and arms smuggling, they had a hand in almost every major crime across the country. What made them even more dangerous was their reputation for eliminating anyone who got too close. Su Ming's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. He wasn't surprised that the syndicate's name was linked to the murders. If the Crimson Phoenix was involved, this wasn't just a random spree killing. There was a purpose behind these deaths, something darker than the public could imagine. As he delved deeper, a name came up repeatedly: Feng Li. Feng Li was a high-ranking member of the syndicate, well known for his involvement in various child abduction cases over the past decade. Despite multiple investigations, the police had never been able to gather solid evidence to bring him down. He was slippery, always a step ahead of law enforcement, and protected by layers of the syndicate's inner network. Su Ming's eyes narrowed as he stared at Feng Li's photo. The man was cold, his face showing no signs of remorse or fear. The criminal world was full of people like him, calculating, merciless, and without any moral compass. But Su Ming knew their type all too well. In his previous life, he had played in the same shadows. This could be it, Su Ming thought, feeling the familiar twinge of excitement he often got when a case started to unravel. But just as quickly, he suppressed it. He didn't want to be dragged into this any more than he already was. Still, there was no avoiding it now. The case had become too big. The media was following every development, and the pressure on the police force, especially on Chief Su, was immense. Su Ming sighed and stood up, his mind already planning the next steps. If they were going to catch Feng Li, they needed to act quickly and decisively. The syndicate wasn't known for giving second chances. And while Su Ming didn't want to admit it, there was a part of him, deep down, that was itching to outsmart these criminals. The thrill of the chase, the challenge of seeing 10 steps ahead, was too familiar to ignore. As he left his study to meet with his father, the weight of what was coming settled on his shoulders. The Crimson Phoenix Syndicate was more than just another criminal organization. They were a hydra, with many heads ready to strike back the moment one was cut off. But Su Ming was ready. He just wished he didn't have to be. In the next few days, Su Ming would find himself entangled deeper in the investigation, slowly revealing connections no one else had seen. He'd use his understanding of criminal psychology to uncover Feng Li's true motivations, exposing the syndicate's darker dealings. But every step would bring him closer to the truth, and closer to the dangerous world he tried to leave behind. This case would be the one that changed everything. Chapter 16. A Reluctant Investigator. Su Ming stood outside the police station, watching his father, Chief Su, give a press conference. The murder of 10 children had shaken the nation, and the public demanded answers. Reporters gathered around, firing questions about the investigation's progress. Chief Su, composed but clearly under pressure, assured them that every effort was being made to solve the case. Su Ming watched silently, hands in his pockets, trying to maintain his distance. He wasn't officially part of the investigation, not yet. But after everything he'd uncovered about Fong Li and the Crimson Phoenix Syndicate, he knew he wouldn't be able to avoid getting involved much longer. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from one of his contacts in the global intelligence community. Though Su Ming had distanced himself from the criminal world, he maintained connections with an underground network that exchanged information about criminal activities across the globe. This network has proven invaluable in cases like this one. I've got intel on Fong Li. He's been spotted moving between safe houses and Longshan. Can't confirm exact locations, but his last known hideout is in the industrial district. Su Ming's mind worked quickly, assessing the information. If Fong Li was still in the city, that meant they had a chance. But the syndicate was known for its elusive methods. They wouldn't stay in one place for long, especially with the police closing in. He sighed, walking towards the entrance of the station. His father had finished the press conference and was now surrounded by officers and investigators inside. Su Ming hesitated at the door, knowing that once he stepped through, he would no longer be able to stay on the sidelines. The murder case had been brutal. 10 innocent children had their lives taken in a series of calculated killings that left no clues behind. The country was horrified, but Su Ming saw patterns in the chaos and subtle mistakes made by the killer. They weren't random. They were too precise. Someone had orchestrated this, and Fong Li was at the heart of it. He stepped inside. Chief Su was poring over reports with his team when he noticed his son enter. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Su Ming hadn't been involved in any cases since his early graduation from the academy. He had kept a low profile, using his genius to avoid the spotlight as much as possible. Su Ming, his father greeted him, motioning him over. I didn't expect to see you here. Are you here to help? Su Ming shrugged, a small smirk on his face. Just passing by. Thought I'd see how things were going. Chief Su raised an eyebrow. You've never been good at just passing by. What do you know? Su Ming chuckled. His father knew him too well. I might have a lead, he said, pulling out his phone and showing the message about Fong Li. One of my contacts spotted Fong Li in the industrial district. It's not much, but it's something. His father's expression shifted. Fong Li? If we can find him, we might finally get a break in this case. Su Ming nodded. He's been careful, but no one is perfect. There are always mistakes, and I've found a few in his movements. We need to move fast, though. He won't stay in one place for long. Chief Su glanced at the other officers. We'll mobilize a team, but you know this is dangerous territory, Su Ming. The Crimson Phoenix doesn't play by the rules. I'm aware, Su Ming said casually. I'm not here to take unnecessary risks. I'll just point you in the right direction. But as he spoke, Su Ming knew that wouldn't be the case. He could never just point and walk away. His mind was already working through the next steps, tracking Fong Li, anticipating his movements, and setting up a plan that would close the net around him. Within hours, the police force was mobilized. Su Ming had returned to his home, hoping that this would be the extent of his involvement. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The pull of the investigation, the thrill of outsmarting a criminal like Fong Li, was too strong to resist. His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from his father. We're moving in on the industrial district. Could use your insight. Su Ming stared at the message for a moment. He had no real obligation to get involved. He could ignore it and let the police handle it. But the part of him that had once been the god of criminals knew better. Without him, they wouldn't stand a chance against the syndicate. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door. By the time he arrived at the industrial district, the police had already surrounded the area. Chief Su was coordinating with tactical teams, giving orders to secure the perimeter. Su Ming approached, his eyes scanning the surroundings. This place was perfect for someone like Fong Li, abandoned warehouses, multiple escape routes, and plenty of places to hide. Where do you think he's holed up? His father asked as Su Ming joined him. Su Ming took a moment, his criminal mind analyzing the environment. He'll be near the center, where visibility is low, but escape routes are plenty. I'd bet he's using the old shipping warehouse. It's got underground tunnels that connect to the sewers. Chief Su nodded, relaying the information to his team. As the officers moved into position, Su Ming watched from a distance, his mind already 10 steps ahead. Fong Li wouldn't go down without a fight, but Su Ming knew the man's weaknesses. This wouldn't be a clean arrest. There would be chaos, violence, and likely more bloodshed. And yet, despite his desire to avoid all of this, Su Ming felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. Chapter 17. Into the Shadows. The rain fell steadily, soaking Su Ming's jacket as he stood outside the industrial district. His father's tactical team was ready to move in on the warehouse. Despite his desire to stay out of it, the situation had once again pulled him in. Su Ming knew too well that fate had a way of latching onto him. Wherever he went, crime seemed to follow. His phone buzzed, and a brief message flashed across the screen from one of his contacts in the underground network. Feng Li's name had popped up in several encrypted channels. The notorious criminal had been linked to some of the most heinous acts, but it was his involvement in the recent massacre of 10 children that struck a nerve. The public outcry had been immense, and Su Ming's father, the criminal police chief, had taken charge of the investigation. Su Ming, stay clear, his father's voice crackled over the police radio. This might get ugly. Su Ming sighed, pocketing his phone. As much as he tried to avoid getting involved, especially given his nature, he couldn't just walk away. Feng Li was no ordinary criminal. He was part of a much larger network that operated in the shadows, and Su Ming knew that bringing him down was crucial. But this wasn't his fight. Not yet, at least. Inside the warehouse, the raid unfolded with brutal efficiency. Gunfire echoed in the cold, metal space as officers moved swiftly through the building. They found evidence of human trafficking, a chilling confirmation of the rumors surrounding Feng Li's operations. However, Feng Li himself had already disappeared. Su Ming watched from the edge of the scene, his mind working through the details. He hadn't expected Feng Li to be caught so easily, but the clues left behind were enough to confirm his suspicions. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. Later that night, back home, Su Ming sat at the kitchen table, lost in thought. His mother, exhausted from a long shift at the hospital, placed a steaming cup of tea in front of him. "You seem distracted," she said gently, sitting down across from him. Su Ming looked up, offering a small smile. "It's nothing. Just a long day. I saw the news. It's heartbreaking about those children." He nodded, the weight of the case pressing on him. "Yeah, it's going to be a hard one to solve." His mother reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "Don't take too much on, Su Ming. You already carry enough." He didn't reply, but the thought lingered in his mind. How could he not take it on? These crimes had a way of finding him, whether he wanted to be involved or not. The days that followed were filled with more questions than answers. Su Ming, despite his reluctance, found himself drawn deeper into the investigation. The public demanded justice for the children, and his father's team worked tirelessly to track down leads. But Su Ming had something more, information that trickled in through his underground network. It wasn't much, but each detail added a piece to the puzzle. His involvement, as usual, was quiet. He didn't flaunt his skills or make a show of solving cases. Instead, he fed his father small bits of insight, guiding the investigation from the shadows. One evening, as he sat reviewing the case files at home, another message pinged on his phone. The network had uncovered new information. Feng Li wasn't acting alone. There were whispers of other players involved, organizations that had been operating in the dark for years. Su Ming leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. This was bigger than just the Crimson Phoenix Syndicate. Something much larger was at play. Before he could dive deeper into the thought, his sister, the third in line, and the family's tech genius entered the room. She noticed the scattered files on the table and smirked. "Back to solving impossible puzzles, I see." Su Ming shrugged. "Just keeping busy." She shook her head, amused. "You can't help yourself? Can you?" He smiled, but didn't respond. She wasn't wrong. As more time passed, the investigation hit several dead ends, and the pressure from the media intensified. Su Ming's father was doing his best to hold things together, but the public's demand for answers grew louder with each passing day. The massacre had shaken the nation, and failure was not an option. Despite his best efforts to remain on the sidelines, Su Ming couldn't help but feel the pull. Each clue, each new piece of information, brought him closer to the truth. And though he tried to keep his distance, crime had a way of following him, no matter where he went. Weeks later, after the case involving Feng Li reached its breaking point, The team stumbled upon new evidence linking the syndicate to a series of unsolved murders. Su Ming's instincts told him this was just the tip of the iceberg, and his network confirmed as much. There were other organizations lurking, waiting for their moment. But even as the case grew more complex, Su Ming knew one thing. He couldn't stay out of it. Chapter 18. The Devil in the Details. Su Ming sat alone in the corner of his room, the hum of the city outside a distant backdrop to his thoughts. Files were scattered across his desk, photos and case notes pinned to a board above, as he quietly studied the details. The investigation had reached a critical juncture, and the country's top minds had no clear lead on the child killer responsible for the heinous murders. Despite his attempts to avoid getting involved, Su Ming couldn't ignore the glaring flaws he saw in the official reports. As much as he hated it, his mind was always on the hunt, always looking for the smallest error that others missed. In his criminal life, details had been the key to survival, and now they were his best weapon for uncovering the truth. He glanced over the autopsy reports again, scrutinizing the photos of each crime scene. Most of the detectives involved saw the cases as random, senseless killings. Su Ming didn't. He knew better than to believe in coincidences. The following morning, Su Ming's father held a briefing at the police headquarters. Officers from various departments gathered, their faces etched with frustration as they discussed the dead ends in the investigation. Su Ming, who had come to drop off lunch for his father, sat quietly in the back, observing. "The suspect leaves no trace," one detective grumbled. "It's like they vanish into thin air." "It's a dead end, sir," another added. "We've checked every possible lead, but the pattern is unpredictable." Su Ming listened intently. In his mind, he could already see the gaps, the oversights. It was obvious to him that these crimes weren't random at all. The killer had left a pattern in their wake, one that everyone was too blinded by desperation to see. When the meeting ended, his father caught his eye. "You're not here just for lunch, are you?" he asked quietly, a knowing smile on his face. Su Ming shrugged. "I've been looking at the reports." His father raised an eyebrow. "And?" "There's a pattern," Su Ming replied, his voice low. "But it's not what you think. The killer is targeting children from the same orphanage." His father frowned, leaning in. "You're sure?" Su Ming nodded. "It's subtle, but if you cross-reference the victims' backgrounds, they all spent time in the same orphanage, even if only briefly. The killer isn't picking them at random. He's revisiting his past." Later that day, Su Ming's father called an emergency meeting, now armed with his son's insight. The team quickly set to work tracing the orphanage records, and just as Su Ming had said, each child had some connection, however minor, to the same place. It wasn't a breakthrough in the traditional sense, but it was enough to narrow down the search. More importantly, it allowed the investigation to move from reactive to proactive. Over the next few days, Su Ming quietly followed the developments, though he kept a distance. Despite his success in pointing them in the right direction, he still preferred to stay on the sidelines. He had no intention of becoming a full-time investigator, not yet, at least. But crime has always had other plans. One evening, Su Ming sat at a local coffee shop, trying to take his mind off the case. His favorite pastime of people watching had always been a source of amusement for him, and for once, he hoped it would be a distraction. But as he sipped his drink, he couldn't help but notice a man across the room acting suspiciously. Su Ming observed him casually, noting the way the man kept glancing around, his hands fidgeting with something inside his jacket pocket. It was the kind of nervous behavior Su Ming had seen 1,000 times before, an amateur trying too hard to stay unnoticed. His criminal instincts kicked in. Su Ming could already tell something wasn't right. And just like that, he found himself sucked back into the world he'd been trying to avoid. Minutes passed, and the man finally stood up, leaving the coffee shop in a hurry. Su Ming hesitated for a moment before following him outside. There was no rational reason for him to get involved, but curiosity gnawed at him. Besides, his gut told him that this was more than just a random encounter. He tailed the man through the streets, watching as he made his way to an abandoned building in a quieter part of town. Su Ming kept his distance, careful not to be spotted. He knew this area, known for its shady dealings and frequent police raids, and it wasn't long before he realized what was going on. The man had been smuggling something. Su Ming didn't need to get too close to confirm his suspicions. Through a broken window, he could see boxes being loaded into a truck, boxes marked with medical supplies, but Su Ming knew better. The black market often disguised their goods this way to avoid suspicion. If it were ordinary supplies, there wouldn't be this level of caution. He could call his father and report it to the authorities. But that would bring attention to the fact that he'd been snooping around, which was the last thing he wanted. Instead, Su Ming did what he did best. He analyzed the situation, looking for any small detail that might help him later. His eyes scanned the area, picking up on the logo on the truck, the faces of the men involved, and the way they moved. Everything was a clue, and Su Ming's mind worked through the puzzle effortlessly. When he'd seen enough, he quietly slipped away, returning home with a mental blueprint of the entire operation. He would pass the information to the network, letting them handle it. Days later, the smuggling ring was busted, and Su Ming's father mentioned it in passing over dinner. "We got a lucky tip-off," his father said. "Brought down an entire operation." Su Ming smiled to himself, but said nothing. As much as he tried to distance himself from it, crime-solving seemed to follow him, like an inevitable shadow. He didn't want to admit it, but the thrill of unraveling mysteries, even the most intricate ones, was hard to resist. But for now, he would keep playing the lazy genius, solving puzzles from the sidelines and letting others take the credit. That was the life he preferred. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. Chapter 19. The Reluctant Genius. Su Ming lay sprawled on his couch, his eyes half-lidded as the flickering lights of his TV bathed the room in a dim glow. A documentary was playing in the background, but he wasn't really paying attention. His mind drifted in and out, battling the boredom that came with inactivity. He sighed. This was supposed to be the life he wanted, a quiet, lazy existence away from the chaos of solving crimes. And yet, no matter how much he tried, trouble always seemed to find him. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he groaned. He knew what it was before even looking. His father had sent him a message, asking him to take a look at the latest case files. It wasn't an order, but the expectation was clear. Su Ming tossed the phone aside and closed his eyes, willing himself to ignore it. He'd help them if it was something critical later. Right now, he was focused on perfecting the art of doing nothing. But the universe, as always, had other plans. A few days later, the country was in an uproar. The police force had officially launched a manhunt for a notorious killer known as the Night Stalker, who had been terrorizing multiple cities. The case had gained national attention, with media outlets covering every development. Su Ming's father, the chief of criminal police, had been put in charge of the task force assigned to capture the elusive murderer. Su Ming didn't need to be told twice to stay away from it. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged into another high-profile case that would ruin his carefully constructed image of a lazy, carefree young man. He was determined to avoid it at all costs. But crime had a way of sticking to him like glue. That evening, Su Ming reluctantly agreed to meet his father for dinner. It wasn't a formal meeting, just a casual family gathering. Or so he thought. As soon as he walked into the dining room, he was greeted by his father's tired expression. His sisters were already seated, each busy with their own conversations, but there was a certain tension in the air. Su Ming could feel it immediately. "We've hit a wall," his father said without preamble, gesturing toward the file sitting on the table. "No leads, no patterns, it's like this guy doesn't exist." Su Ming didn't need to look at the file. He'd already heard enough about the case from the news. The Night Stalker was a ghost, a killer with no apparent motive, no identifiable pattern. The police had been chasing him for months, but every attempt to capture him had ended in frustration. "Why are you telling me this?" Su Ming asked, knowing full well why. His father gave him a long look. "Because you have a gift, and we could use your insight." Su Ming sighed and leaned back in his chair. He was tempted to decline, to tell them that this wasn't his problem. But deep down, he knew that ignoring the situation wouldn't make it go away. And, as much as he tried to deny it, there was a part of him that couldn't resist a challenge, especially when it came to cases like this. He grabbed the file reluctantly and flipped through it. "I'll look, but no promises," he muttered. Hours later, Su Ming sat alone in his room, the file open in front of him. He scanned through the evidence, his mind working on autopilot. The details of the case were all there, witness statements, forensics, crime scene photos, but nothing jumped out at him. At least, not at first. Something caught his eye as he read through one of the victim profiles. It was a small, seemingly insignificant detail, one that the investigators had overlooked. The victim's address. Su Ming pulled up the other files and began cross-referencing the victim's locations. At first glance, they seemed random, different cities, different neighborhoods, but when he mapped them out, a clear pattern emerged. Each victim had lived within a certain radius of an old, abandoned building, a building that had been the site of a gruesome murder 10 years earlier. It was too much of a coincidence. Su Ming leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Got you," he whispered to himself. The next day, Su Ming casually mentioned his findings to his father over breakfast. He didn't make a big deal out of it, just dropped the information like it was nothing. "There's a pattern," Su Ming said as he munched on his toast. "The victims all lived near the old factory that was shut down after that murder case 10 years ago. Could be worth checking out." His father stared at him, incredulous. "You found that just by glancing at the files?" Su Ming shrugged. "It wasn't that hard." His father shook his head, clearly amazed by his son's effortless genius. "You really are something, you know that?" Su Ming gave a lazy grin. "Yeah, well, it's a curse." Later that day, the task force followed Su Ming's lead and raided the abandoned building. Sure enough, they found the killer's hideout. Evidence, weapons, and a stash of personal items belonging to the victims. It was the breakthrough they needed, and within days, the Night Stalker was apprehended. Su Ming stayed out of the limelight, content to let others take the credit. He didn't need the recognition. He just wanted to get back to his quiet, lazy life. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't happen. No matter how hard he tried to avoid it, crime would always follow him. And as much as he hated to admit it, he was good at solving cases. Too good, in fact. So he continued playing the lazy genius, staying in the background, solving crimes when necessary, and always pretending that he wasn't interested. At least, until the next case came knocking. Chapter 20. A case too close to home. After the Night Stalker case was closed, Su Ming managed to lay low for a while. He spent his days lounging at home, avoiding the crime scenes, and generally enjoying the peaceful life he had always dreamed of. But peace was fleeting in his world, and it wasn't long before another storm brewed on the horizon. This time, it hit much closer to home. It started with a call from his father. Not an unusual occurrence, but this one carried an edge of tension that immediately put Su Ming on alert. His father's voice was calm, but Su Ming could tell something was wrong. "I need you to come to the station," his father said. "It's urgent." Su Ming sighed, already feeling the weight of responsibility creeping back in. "Can't you handle it?" "I'm not on the clock, you know. This isn't just another case. It involves the family," his father replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Su Ming's heart sank. Family? That was a line that shouldn't be crossed. Not in his world. He had always kept a strict separation between his personal life and the chaos of the outside world. But now, that boundary was being tested. At the station, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Officers moved quickly, their faces grim as they exchanged quiet words. Su Ming's father met him at the entrance, his usual calm demeanor strained. "What's going on?" Su Ming asked, his laziness quickly dissipating. His father handed him a file, his expression hard. "We've been dealing with a series of disappearances, children, all around the same age from different regions. It started small, but now it's escalated." Su Ming frowned as he skimmed through the file. 10 children were all abducted within the last few months, with no leads or evidence pointing to their whereabouts. The case had shaken the nation, and public pressure was mounting on the authorities to find answers. "And the family connection?" Su Ming asked, already bracing for the answer. His father's voice lowered. "One of the missing children is the son of a close family friend. You might remember the Chin family?" Su Ming's memory flickered. The Chin family had always been close to his own. Their son, Xiao Chun, was around 8 years old, bright, curious, always full of energy. And now, he was one of the missing. "That's why I called you," his father said quietly. "I know you're trying to stay out of this, but we need every mind on this, especially yours." Su Ming stared at the file, his thoughts racing. He hadn't wanted to get involved, but now that it concerned the safety of someone so close to his family, he couldn't turn his back. "Not this time." With a sigh, he nodded. "All right, I'll help, but don't expect miracles." As Su Ming dove into the case, his mind quickly switched gears. He started with the basics, combing through the locations of the disappearances, cross-referencing details, and trying to find anything that might tie them together. His first instinct was to look for a pattern, just like he had with the Night Stalker case. But this one was different. The abductions were scattered, seemingly random. Different cities, different neighborhoods, and no immediate link between the victims or their families. But Su Ming knew better than to accept surface-level details. He started digging deeper, pulling up old reports, looking for any mention of similar cases that had gone unnoticed. After hours of sifting through data, he finally found something, a small, overlooked detail buried in an old report. Years ago, there had been rumors of a trafficking ring that targeted children, but the group had been dismantled before it could fully operate. At least, that's what the official record said. Su Ming's gut told him otherwise. It was too coincidental that these new disappearances shared the same profile as those earlier attempts. It seemed the group had re-emerged, but this time they were operating more cautiously. But what was their endgame? And why children? The following days were a blur of investigation. Su Ming worked quietly, avoiding attention while gathering intel through his network of global contacts. Though he wasn't officially part of any organization, his skills in digging up hidden information were unmatched. His secret community had members spread all over the world, and through them, he began to piece together the puzzle. Bit by bit, a clearer picture emerged. The children were being taken for more than just ransom. There was a darker, more sinister motive at play, something tied to illegal experimentation, possibly even organ trafficking. Su Ming's blood ran cold at the thought. But it still wasn't enough. He needed concrete proof, something that would lead them to the mastermind behind these disappearances. One night, while staring at his map of abductions, something clicked. All the locations where the children had disappeared formed a rough perimeter around a central area, a district known for its high-security research facilities. The connection was too strong to ignore. Of course, Su Ming muttered under his breath. The children weren't being moved randomly. They were being taken to a central location, hidden in plain sight, right under everyone's noses. With this realization, he quickly informed his father. The police launched a full-scale operation to raid the facility in question, but Su Ming stayed behind the scenes, as always, not wanting to draw unnecessary attention. The raid was successful. Inside, they found evidence of illegal human experimentation, along with the missing children, who were miraculously unharmed. The operation led to the arrest of several high-ranking officials connected to the criminal organization, though the true mastermind remained elusive. After the case was wrapped up, Su Ming returned to his usual routine, if it could even be called that. He had solved the case and helped rescue the children, but as always, the recognition wasn't what he wanted. Crime's like a shadow, Su Ming muttered to himself one evening, staring out at the city from his window. No matter where I go, it follows. He wasn't wrong. Every time he tried to distance himself from the chaos, it crept back into his life. It was frustrating, but he couldn't deny the thrill of outsmarting criminals, of seeing the puzzle pieces fall into place. For now, though, he would enjoy the calm, because if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was that peace wouldn't last long. Chapter 21, A Quiet Mind, A Loud World. After the operation that dismantled the child trafficking ring, Su Ming attempted once again to retreat into his quiet life. For the next few days, he managed to avoid all mention of the case, steering clear of the news and any official acknowledgments. His father, proud but understanding, didn't push him to take on more responsibility. The family friend, Xiao Chen's parents, had expressed their heartfelt thanks, but Su Ming had brushed it off with his usual nonchalance. In his heart, he hoped this would be the end of it for now, but things didn't always go the way he wanted. The days blurred together, each one more quiet than the last. Su Ming had taken to sitting on the balcony of the family home, staring out at the city below. For someone with a criminal genius mindset, trained to detect patterns and anomalies, the world around him seemed like a dull and predictable puzzle. Su Ming's laziness had always been part of his genius. He found joy in doing nothing, especially if it meant avoiding the responsibilities that came with his extraordinary mind. His family, especially his father and mother, were beginning to worry about his constant detachment from their work. Though they admired his skills and respected his decision to stay out of the spotlight, they couldn't ignore the fact that every time he stepped into the world of investigation, he brought results that no one else could. But just as Su Ming was beginning to feel like he could maintain his lazy existence for a while, the world around him refused to let him rest. One afternoon, while sitting in the family's spacious living room, Su Ming's phone rang. He glanced at it with a groan, half expecting it to be another family member asking him for some small favor. But it wasn't. It was a message from an old contact in his secret intelligence network. Need intel? Check this out. Attached to the message was a series of encrypted files. Su Ming's curiosity piqued, though he reminded himself that he wasn't supposed to be working on anything. He had sworn off crime-solving for at least a week after the last case. But as always, temptation gnawed at him. Opening the files, Su Ming quickly decrypted them. The information inside was startling. A series of recent murders, all of them brutal, with no clear motive, and worse, no trace of the culprit. The police had been baffled, but the files hinted at something much darker, a pattern only someone with Su Ming's mindset could see. These are kids again, Su Ming muttered, noticing the ages of the victims. All are between 7 and 10 years old. The gruesome nature of the murders, combined with the fact that they involved children, hit a nerve. His father had mentioned that there were unsolved cases, but nothing like this. Something in Su Ming clicked. That criminal genius mind of his was fully activated. No matter how much he wanted to be lazy, he could never escape this. There was always some new criminal element or unsolved case that demanded his attention. Despite himself, he started making mental connections. The next few hours passed in a blur. Su Ming was entirely engrossed in his work, digging through the data and matching it with what he already knew. His mind, sharp and methodical, traced the details of each murder, identifying small inconsistencies in the police reports and connecting dots that others had missed. One thing became clear: the murders weren't random. This was the work of a single individual, someone meticulous, intelligent, and cruel. The killer had managed to elude capture by creating just enough chaos to mislead the police. But to Su Ming, the sloppiness stood out. In his criminal mindset, he saw these loopholes and mistakes as pediatric, a sign of an overconfident criminal. By the time Su Ming finished his analysis, he knew exactly what the police were dealing with: a serial killer who had escalated his behavior after being dormant for years. But this wasn't just any serial killer. This person had an agenda, an obsession with targeting children. That evening, Su Ming reluctantly met with his father to relay what he had uncovered. His father, though exhausted from the pressures of his job, listened intently. As Su Ming laid out the details, piece by piece, the horror of the case settled in. "Are you sure about this?" his father asked quietly, his brow furrowed in worry. "The team's been working on this for weeks, and they've barely scratched the surface." Su Ming nodded, eyes fixed on the table between them. "I'm sure. I've seen killers like this before, Dad. They escalate when they think no one's watching, but they always make mistakes. It's just a matter of time." His father stared at him for a long moment before letting out a heavy sigh. "You're right. You always are. I'll help with this," Su Ming said, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. The lazy part of him resented the commitment, but he couldn't walk away. "Not this time. But after this case, I'm going back to my usual routine." His father smiled knowingly, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Of course, son. You deserve some peace." As Su Ming returned to his room, he found himself staring at the ceiling, mind racing despite his best efforts to relax. No matter how hard he tried to distance himself from solving cases, crime followed him like a shadow. For now, though, his path was clear. He would solve this case, catch the killer, and hopefully put an end to the nightmare that had haunted the nation. But deep down, Su Ming knew that peace was always temporary. Chapter 22. The Silent Threads of Death. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Su Ming groggily rolled out of bed. He had spent the night mentally mapping out the serial killer's movements. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You're always right." Yet, there was no joy in being right this time. Sighing, he glanced at the files again. The killer's mistakes were obvious to Su Ming, but concealed from the rest. He could see the killer's progression, the escalation, and the one flaw that would lead to their downfall. A signature mistake, a common one made by those who thought themselves invincible. As the clock ticked away, Su Ming prepared himself mentally. His father's team had no idea what they were up against. Only he could pull the thread that would unravel the killer's facade. Su Ming arrived at the police station with little fanfare, preferring to stay under the radar. He wasn't officially part of the investigation. He preferred it that way. The less attention he drew, the better. "Hey, you're Su Ming, right?" The chief's son, a younger officer, asked as Su Ming entered the building. He gave a lazy nod, barely acknowledging the curious eyes following him as he made his way to his father's office. The police chief sat behind his desk, clearly worn down by the weight of the case. "We've had another one," his father said without preamble, sliding a file across the desk toward him. "Last night, a 10-year-old girl." Su Ming's stomach twisted, but he said nothing, scanning the details. "Another piece to the puzzle, a predictable one." "He's getting sloppy," Su Ming remarked, noting the minor mistakes the killer had made in covering his tracks. "The longer this goes on, the more confident he gets." His father leaned back in his chair. "We're getting nowhere, Su Ming. The team's morale is low, and the media is all over this. Then let's catch him before he gets any worse." Su Ming's voice was calm, almost detached, though inside he felt the creeping urgency. That evening, Su Ming revisited the crime scenes in his mind, meticulously piecing together the killer's pattern. He had no doubt now. The murderer's next move was imminent. And with every crime, he grew bolder. But Su Ming wasn't going to let him get away with it. Chapter 23. Chasing Shadows. Su Ming sat at the police station, reviewing the new murder case files, while others buzzed around him. His mind worked quietly, running through every detail. While the rest of the team seemed flustered and exhausted, Su Ming's approach remained calm, though his lazy demeanor disguised the genius underneath. He closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the killer's movements. The crime scenes, the pattern in victim selection, everything pointed to a psychological need that was growing more desperate with each kill. There was no pleasure in it for Su Ming, but the efficiency with which he analyzed the case made it clear that this was where he thrived. Officer Zhang, a seasoned investigator, glanced at Su Ming with uncertainty. "You don't even look like you're trying, kid," he said half-jokingly. "I don't need to try that hard," Su Ming replied lazily. "The killer's routine is easy to read if you know what to look for." Zhang raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? Enlighten me?" Without opening his eyes, Su Ming leaned back in his chair. "The killer is sloppy. He's overconfident. The way he moves between locations, and the lack of care in disposing of evidence, he's leaving a trail. But he thinks he's untouchable because no one has caught him yet." Zhang frowned. Leaning over the file Su Ming had been reading. "Where do you think he'll strike next?" Su Ming finally opened his eyes, staring at the map on the wall. "He's been gradually moving outwards from the city center. The next attack will be in the suburbs. He's trying to create a sense of randomness, but the locations aren't random at all. They're connected by something in his personal life." Zhang looked skeptical. "And how do you know that?" Su Ming gave a lazy shrug. "Just a feeling, but we'll find out soon enough." The next day, Su Ming's prediction came true. A body was found in the suburbs, just as he had said. The police rushed to the scene, but Su Ming stayed back, seemingly uninterested in going out. Instead, he had Officer Zhang relay details to him, preferring to analyze from afar. His father, Chief Su, was impressed by how quickly Su Ming had narrowed down the killer's movement, though he didn't say it openly. The rest of the team, still unaware of the full scope of Su Ming's abilities, marveled at how he could solve so much while appearing to do so little. "Don't you ever want to be out there, catching the guy?" Zhang asked him later, over a cup of coffee. "I'm not interested in the chase," Su Ming replied. "I'm interested in the result." That evening, Su Ming sat alone in his room, piecing together the killer's profile. The pattern was getting clearer. He had the information he needed, and the police were closing in. It wouldn't be long before they caught the murderer, if they followed his lead. The killer's arrogance would be his downfall, but Su Ming knew better than to underestimate him completely. The final trap had to be set perfectly. One wrong move, and the killer might disappear again. But Su Ming wouldn't let that happen. Chapter 24. The Final Trap. The morning air in the precinct was thick with anticipation. After Su Ming's last deduction about the killer's movements, the entire team was on high alert. Every officer was on edge, except for Su Ming, who sat calmly in the corner, feet up on the desk, sipping a cup of tea. His lazy posture betrayed none of the focus in his mind. Chief Su called for a meeting, gathering all the investigators in the main briefing room. Maps were pinned to the walls, and potential hotspots for the next attack were marked out. Su Ming's predictions had been spot on so far, so his input was valued, despite his nonchalant attitude. "We've tracked down a pattern of where the murderer is likely to strike next," Chief Su began. "But this time, we need to be prepared for a more aggressive move. He's getting desperate." One of the investigators, Officer Liu, stepped forward, pointing at the map. "The pattern suggests he'll strike here next, near the old industrial zone. It's isolated, fewer cameras, easier for him to operate." Su Ming glanced at the map lazily. "He won't go there?" The room went quiet. All eyes turned to him. Officer Liu frowned. "Why not? The evidence points to it." Su Ming stretched his arms and leaned back further into his chair. "He's been sloppy, but he's not stupid. He knows we're watching those obvious spots. He'll go somewhere completely unexpected, someplace we're not even considering. You're thinking like a cop. He's thinking like a predator. Then where do you suggest?" Chief Su asked, his voice calm but curious. Su Ming's eyes lazily scanned the room before settling on a smaller spot on the map, an abandoned apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. "There. It's far enough from the others, but close enough to his usual radius. He'll feel safe, and it's a location he can control." The team exchanged looks, unsure whether to trust Su Ming's instinct. After all, no direct evidence pointed to the complex. "Trust me," Su Ming said quietly, his tone confident but bored. "That's where he'll be." That night, the police set up a quiet perimeter around the abandoned complex. Officers disguised as vagrants and city workers were positioned throughout the area. Su Ming remained at the station, monitoring everything remotely. His father insisted he stay out of the field for now, given his age. Su Ming didn't argue. He preferred the quiet anyway. Hours passed, the tension rising with every minute. Suddenly, an alert came through the radio. A figure had been spotted entering the complex, matching the description of their suspect. Chief Su's voice crackled through the station's communication line. "We got him. Moving in now." The officers moved in, swift and precise, surrounding the building. Su Ming watched the live feed on the monitors, his sharp mind analyzing every angle. The killer had been caught off guard. He'd underestimated their coordination, and now there was nowhere to run. It was over quickly. The killer was apprehended without a fight, his overconfidence his undoing. Back at the station, the mood was celebratory, but Su Ming remained detached. He had solved the case, predicted the killer's next move, and guided the team to victory. But to him, it was just another day. Chief Su approached him, offering a rare moment of fatherly pride. "You did well, Su Ming. Your instincts were right on target." Su Ming gave a half-hearted smile. "I told you. It was easy." "You make it look easy," Chief Su replied, shaking his head. "But you've got a gift. Don't take it for granted." As the team celebrated around him, Su Ming slipped out of the station. The case was solved, but he felt no satisfaction from it. Crime followed him wherever he went, whether he wanted it or not. Chapter 25. The Unsolved Past. After the successful capture of the child murderer, Su Ming hoped for some peace. The case had drained everyone in the precinct, and they all needed a break. But Su Ming wasn't the type to celebrate victories or linger in the spotlight. Instead, he returned home, slipping back into his usual lazy routine, avoiding any extra work and hoping for a quiet life. Unfortunately for him, quiet never lasted long. A few days after the case had wrapped up, Su Ming received an unexpected call from his father. Chief Su's voice sounded unusually tense. "Su Ming, I need you to come to the precinct. Isn't there anyone else?" Su Ming replied, already knowing the answer. "Just come." When Su Ming arrived at the precinct, he noticed a somber mood had overtaken the place. Officers whispered in corners, and there was a distinct air of frustration. His father was waiting for him in his office, a stack of old case files spread across his desk. "What's going on?" Su Ming asked, slouching into a chair, his lazy demeanor still intact. Chief Su handed him a file. "This is an unsolved case from 10 years ago, a series of child murders that shook the country. We thought we had a suspect back then, but, well, the evidence didn't hold, and the trail went cold." Su Ming flipped through the file, his eyes scanning the details. It was a gruesome case. 10 children had been murdered over a few months. The killings stopped as suddenly as they had started, and despite the efforts of some of the country's best investigators, the case was never solved. Su Ming's father sighed, sitting down heavily. "The president himself has requested that we take another look at the case. I was one of the lead investigators back then, but we hit a wall. Now, with new technology and techniques, we might have a chance. But I need your help." Su Ming looked up from the file, raising an eyebrow. "Why me? You have a unique way of seeing things. You've proven that more than once. In this case, I know it's old, but there's something about it that's been bothering me. It feels unfinished." For a moment, Su Ming considered his options. He could refuse, leave the past buried, and try to escape the life that kept pulling him back into criminal cases. But as he looked at the grim photos and the details of the case, something clicked in his mind. A challenge, a puzzle, and deep down, Su Ming could never resist those. "Fine," he muttered, tossing the file back onto the desk. "I'll take a look, but don't expect me to work miracles." Chief Su smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you, son." Over the next few days, Su Ming delved into the old case. The murders had taken place across several cities, with no clear connection between the victims except their age and the brutal manner of their deaths. The police had pursued numerous leads back then, but each one had fizzled out. As Su Ming pored over the evidence, his mind worked quietly, piecing together fragments. His instincts told him that the killer had been meticulous, careful to avoid leaving a clear trail. But Su Ming had always been good at finding the tiniest cracks in even the most solid cases. One detail caught his eye: a small, seemingly insignificant mistake. Something that had been overlooked during the original investigation. It wasn't much, just a slight inconsistency in the reports about the victims' families. But to Su Ming, it was enough. He stayed up late that night, working through the files with his usual lazy posture, though his mind was razor-sharp. After hours of reviewing old witness testimonies and re-examining forensic reports, Su Ming had a theory. The killer hadn't just chosen random victims. There was a pattern, hidden beneath the surface, a connection that no one had seen before. And the killer hadn't disappeared. He had simply gone underground, waiting for the right time to strike again. Su Ming sighed, leaning back in his chair. His father had been right. This case wasn't over, and it was about to get much more complicated. Chapter 26. Family Dynamics. After days of working on the old case, Su Ming finally had a chance to take a breather. The precinct had been quiet, and the child murder case was still unsolved, but at a standstill while they processed new leads. His father hadn't pressured him, giving him space to work alone. But as always, the family came first in the Su household. With nothing pressing at the precinct, Su Ming decided to head home, hoping for a few peaceful hours away from crime scenes and case files. The Su family mansion was as grand as ever, a sprawling estate tucked away in one of Longchen's most prestigious neighborhoods. As Su Ming walked through the entrance, he immediately noticed the lively atmosphere. His sisters were home. Su Ming, his eldest sister, Su Lifin, called out from the living room. The successful businesswoman was perched on the couch, a cup of tea in hand, looking effortlessly elegant in her professional attire. Finally done playing detective? Su Ming smirked lazily, kicking off his shoes and dropping onto the couch beside her. "For now, what's all the commotion here?" "Family meeting," Su Lifan said, rolling her eyes. "You know how Dad is. He wants us all to gather for dinner tonight. It's been too long since we've all been together." Su Ming groaned inwardly. Family meetings usually meant long conversations about careers, expectations, and goals, topics he had little interest in. His sisters were all accomplished in their fields, but Su Ming preferred a low-key lifestyle, even if his recent cases kept dragging him into the spotlight. As he reclined on the couch, his third sister, Su Shui, the nation's top hacker, appeared from the hallway. "Su Ming heard you cracked another case. You really can't stay out of trouble, can you?" Su Ming shrugged lazily. "It finds me, not the other way around." Su Shui smirked. "You're just a crime magnet. Honestly, with your skills, you could make a killing in the cyber world. If you ever get tired of playing detective, give me a call." Su Ming waved her off. "I'm fine where I am." His mother, Su Lan, walked into the room just as the conversation started veering into teasing territory. As the country's top doctor, she exuded authority, but her warmth toward her children was unmistakable. "All right, enough teasing. Everyone to the dining room. Dinner's almost ready." The dining room buzzed with conversation as the family gathered. Su Ming's father, Chief Su, sat at the head of the table, his commanding presence unmistakable. His sisters, each accomplished in their own right, filled the room with energy, chatting about their work, recent travels, and upcoming projects. For Su Ming, these dinners were a reminder of just how different he was from his siblings. They were all driven, ambitious, and constantly pushing the boundaries in their respective fields. Meanwhile, he'd rather spend his days in a hammock, avoiding as much responsibility as possible. But tonight, even he couldn't completely tune out the conversation. His fifth sister, Su Ning, who was a captain in the Special Forces, mentioned something that caught his attention. "There's been some strange activity near the border," she said between bites of food. "A few skirmishes, nothing serious yet, but tensions are rising. Command is keeping an eye on things." Su Ming's lazy demeanor remained unchanged, but he filed the information away. He had learned long ago that even the smallest pieces of information could be useful later. Besides, he cared about his family, even if he didn't always show it. His mother, Su Lan, turned to him during a lull in the conversation. "Su Ming, how are you holding up? I know you've been working hard lately." Su Ming gave a half-hearted smile. "I'm fine, Mom. Just trying to keep things balanced." His mother smiled warmly. "That's all I ask. Just make sure you're taking care of yourself." For the rest of the evening, Su Ming let himself relax. The conversations flowed easily, with the occasional playful jab thrown his way by his sisters. Even his father, usually so serious, lightened up as they talked about everything from politics to family gossip. Later that night, Su Ming found himself alone in the garden, enjoying the peace. The stars were bright, and for once, he wasn't thinking about cases, criminals, or investigations. It was a rare moment of serenity, something he had learned to appreciate. As he sat there, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his contacts in the network community he was part of. They were exchanging information on global criminal activity, and while Su Ming didn't want to be involved, he always kept one foot in the door, just in case. He sighed, closing the message. Even on a quiet night like this, crime seemed to follow him. But for now, at least, he could enjoy the moment. Chapter 27. The Echoes of the Past. Su Ming sat in his room the next morning, still feeling the warmth of last night's family dinner. The lively chatter, his sisters teasing him, and the brief moments of serenity were a welcome change from his usual routine. He leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the sprawling city of Longchen below. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have a peaceful life. Then his phone buzzed. His father had texted him, asking him to meet at the station. Su Ming sighed heavily. So much for peace. Arriving at the station, Su Ming walked through the halls with his usual lazy demeanor, hands stuffed in his pockets. Despite his outward appearance, everyone in the precinct knew that Su Ming was far from lazy when it came to solving cases. His father, Chief Su, stood waiting for him in his office. As Su Ming entered, he immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. His father's usually composed expression was tight, a hint of worry in his eyes. "Su Ming, we've got something serious," Chief Su began, handing him a file. Su Ming opened it, and his expression shifted slightly, his usual nonchalance giving way to something more focused. The file detailed a series of murders. Children, 10 of them, all killed in different parts of the country. The most disturbing part was the pattern. Each child had gone missing for exactly 3 days before their bodies were found, and the police had no solid leads. "The country is in an uproar," his father said, his voice heavy. "We've kept the details quiet, but people are starting to notice. We can't let this go on." Su Ming's mind began working immediately, piecing together the limited information. His father's presence, usually a source of quiet confidence, only underscored the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a case, it was a national crisis. "Where do I come in?" Su Ming asked, his tone deceptively casual, masking the gears turning in his head. "I need your help," Chief Su said, his voice steady but pleading. "The entire country's police force has been working on this, but we're getting nowhere. You've got an eye for details others miss. I know you didn't want to get involved in cases like this, but I'm asking you as your father." Su Ming leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't like getting involved, especially in cases this heavy. His lazy nature screamed for him to avoid it. But something about the desperation in his father's voice, combined with the weight of the situation, made it impossible for him to refuse. "All right," Su Ming said after a long pause. "I'll look into it, but I'm not making any promises." Chief Su nodded, relief washing over his face. "That's all I can ask for." The rest of the day was a blur of research, reading through the case files and analyzing the information. Su Ming worked quietly, methodically, his mind laser-focused on the details. The pattern of the kidnappings intrigued him. 3 days, spread across different regions, with no clear connection between the victims. He mulled over the possibilities. A lone killer? An organized group? The precision of the crimes suggested planning, but the scattered locations made it difficult to trace. And then there was the issue of motive. Why target children? Su Ming's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from one of his contacts in the international network. It was an update on a similar pattern of child disappearances in a neighboring country, something that hadn't yet been publicized. "Looks like it's not just here," Su Ming muttered to himself. His instincts told him there was a bigger picture, something connecting these cases beyond borders. The pieces were there, scattered like fragments of a puzzle, but Su Ming knew it would take time to fit them together. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. Crime followed him wherever he went, no matter how much he tried to avoid it. Even when he wanted nothing more than to live a quiet, lazy life, the world had other plans. But Su Ming had always been a genius at solving puzzles. He just preferred not to admit it. Later that evening, Su Ming returned home, his mind still racing with thoughts about the case. His mother, Su Lan, immediately noticed his distracted state as he walked through the door. "You've been working hard," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Don't forget to rest." Su Ming gave her a tired smile. "I'll try." As the evening wore on, Su Ming found himself sitting in the living room with his sisters, who were catching up on their day's events. For a while, he let their conversations wash over him, a comforting background to the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. His third sister, Su Shui, glanced over at him, noticing his silence. "You're thinking about work again, aren't you?" Su Ming shrugged. "Can't help it. You should take a break," Su Shui said, though her teasing tone hinted that she knew he wouldn't. "You're too young to be this stressed." Su Ming chuckled softly. "Maybe," but deep down, he knew there was no escaping it. The murders, the puzzle, the network of information swirling around him, it was all leading somewhere. He just had to figure out where. Chapter 28, The Unseen Web. Days passed since Su Ming had agreed to look into the troubling child murders, and the weight of the case continued to press down on him. Each file he examined, each victim's photo, each shred of evidence gnawed at his mind. The puzzle was far from complete, but his instincts told him there was something bigger at play, a vast, unseen web connecting these murders beyond the surface. Still, crime wasn't patient. It didn't wait for one case to be solved before stirring up another. And as much as Su Ming tried to focus on this high-profile case, other crimes began to pull at him. His network contacts were abuzz with chatter, not just about the child murders, but about other sinister movements in the underworld. Su Ming stood in front of a whiteboard, several photos of the victims pinned up alongside maps of where the bodies had been found. He tapped his chin thoughtfully, his mind piecing together fragments of information, trying to see what the others had missed. The spread of locations, the precision of the kidnappings. It all pointed to a meticulously planned operation, yet the motive remained elusive. A knock on the door broke his concentration. His father, Chief Su, entered, looking slightly more rested than the previous days, though the tension still lined his features. "How's it going?" Chief Su asked. Su Ming's gaze remained on the board. "I'm getting there, but I don't have enough to draw any solid conclusions yet. Something about the timing feels too deliberate. Almost like they want us to focus on one place while something else happens somewhere else." Chief Su nodded, trusting his son's instincts. "We've been combing through reports from different regions, trying to find any connection. But so far, nothing stands out." Su Ming sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's there. We just haven't seen it yet." Just as Su Ming was about to dive back into his thoughts, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was one of his contacts from the international network, someone who had a knack for digging up crucial intel. Su Ming's eyes narrowed as he read the message. Another incident in a nearby region. Similar pattern. The kid missing for 3 days. No trace yet. Sending details. "Looks like we got another one," Su Ming said, his voice quiet but heavy with the implications. "But this one, it's different. They're escalating." Hours later, Su Ming sat in a dimly lit room, the quiet hum of his laptop filling the silence as he sifted through data. His contact had sent him the details of the new kidnapping case, but this time, something stood out, a subtle shift in the method. It wasn't a copy of the previous murders. It was a variation, almost as if the killers were refining their tactics. "They're evolving," Su Ming muttered to himself. He noted the changes, minor at first glance, but significant in their implications. His phone buzzed again, this time with a different message. Another case, but unrelated to the child murders. A high-profile businessman had been found dead under mysterious circumstances, and the police had no leads. Su Ming glanced at the file, but quickly pushed it aside. He had to focus on one thing at a time. Just as he did, the door creaked open. His third sister, Su Shui, peered in, noticing the lines of stress on his face. "Still working?" she asked, a playful smile tugging at her lips. Su Ming leaned back in his chair. "I can't seem to avoid it. You were always like this. Even when we were kids," Su Shui said as she stepped into the room. "Always overthinking, always trying to solve the next big puzzle." Su Ming smiled faintly, remembering the countless hours he'd spent analyzing everything around him, even when he was younger. It was in his nature to see through the cracks in things, to find what others overlooked. "I guess some things don't change," Su Ming admitted. Su Shui sat beside him, glancing at the scattered files. "You'll figure it out. You always do." The next morning, Su Ming arrived at the police station to find a fresh set of eyes waiting for him. An experienced detective from another province, called in to help with the case. The man introduced himself as Detective Zhao, a no-nonsense investigator with a sharp mind and a reputation for cracking tough cases. "I've heard a lot about you, Su Ming," Detective Zhao said as they shook hands. Youngest investigator in the force, with a mind that puts most of us to shame. Su Ming raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've been talking to my father." Zhao chuckled. "Maybe, but from what I've seen, it's true." Together, they began going over the case files again, piecing what they could. Detective Zhao had brought new insights, patterns he'd seen in other regions, and soon the two of them were bouncing theories off one another, their minds working in sync. But as the investigation continued, something gnawed at Su Ming. He had the distinct feeling that someone was watching them, manipulating the situation from behind the scenes. There were too many coincidences, too many loose threads that seemed deliberately placed. Su Ming's eyes drifted to the clock. Time was running out. Another child had just gone missing, and the team had less than 3 days to find them before it was too late. Chapter 29. A Race Against Time. The clock was ticking. Su Ming's eyes stayed fixed on the board in front of him, photos of the missing children haunting him. The newly disappeared child, a 9-year-old boy named Lin Fei, had been taken just hours ago, and the pressure was mounting. The media was already buzzing, and the public was growing more terrified with each passing hour. Detective Zhao stood beside him, arms crossed, studying the same images. If we don't find this kid soon, it'll be the same story as the others. We can't let that happen again. Su Ming nodded absent-mindedly, his mind spinning through possibilities. He had pored over the details 100 times already, but the case was still just out of his reach. Patterns, locations, and timelines danced in his head, but there was one missing link that would pull it all together. His father, Chief Su, entered the room, his face hard as stone. We've deployed every resource possible. Teams are searching the city and surrounding areas. But we need a lead, Su Ming. What do we have? Not enough, Su Ming replied. His voice was calm, but the tension was evident in his eyes. But there's a pattern. Each kidnapping is more refined than the last. Whoever's behind this is adjusting their methods, learning from their mistakes. Chief Su frowned, glancing between his son and Detective Zhao. How do we use that? Su Ming stepped closer to the board, pointing at the map. The kidnappings follow a specific route, almost like they're closing in on something. This latest victim was taken on the outskirts, much closer to the city center than the others. They're getting bolder. Detective Zhao narrowed his eyes. You're saying the next one will be even more central? Exactly, Su Ming replied. But it's more than that. I think they're moving toward a final target. These are distractions, pieces of a larger game. If we can predict where they'll strike next, we can stop them before they reach their goal. Chief Su nodded. I'll get our teams to focus on the inner city. We'll double the patrols. Su Ming shook his head. That won't be enough. Whoever's behind this has connections, possibly even people inside our force. They'll know if we move too aggressively. We need to be subtle, catch them off guard. The room went quiet as his words sank in. The idea that someone within their ranks could be involved was a bitter pill to swallow. But Su Ming had learned long ago that nothing could be taken at face value. We need to think like them, Su Ming continued. Every mistake they've made has been an intentional choice, a distraction. They've been testing us, seeing how we react. If we want to stop them, we have to anticipate their next move. Hours later, Su Ming sat in front of his laptop, running simulations and cross-referencing data. His contacts in the global intel community had been feeding him information on similar cases around the world, but nothing seemed to match the precision of the kidnappings here. Whoever was behind this was operating on a different level, and Su Ming knew he was dealing with a criminal mind almost as sharp as his own. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his most trusted contacts in the network. Got something for you. Could be connected. Check your inbox. Su Ming opened the attachment. A series of reports from an unsolved case in a neighboring country. The methods were eerily similar. High-profile kidnappings, escalating in frequency and precision, with no ransom demands or clear motives. The victims were always children, but none of the bodies were ever found. His pulse quickened. This was it. This was the missing piece. They're not killing them, Su Ming muttered to himself. They're taking them for something else? He quickly typed out a message to his contact, asking for more details. As he waited for the response, his mind raced with possibilities. Organ trafficking? Slave labor? Or something even darker? Before he could dwell on it, there was another knock at his door. This time, it was his fifth sister, Su Wei, the Special Forces captain. You're still at it? She asked, leaning against the doorframe. You look like you haven't slept in days. Su Ming rubbed his temples, trying to stave off the growing headache. I'll sleep when this is over. Su Wei stepped into the room, her usually stoic expression softening slightly. I heard about the latest case. Do you think it's the same people? Definitely, Su Ming replied. But I think there's more to this than just random kidnappings. I'm close to figuring it out. Su Wei nodded, glancing at the mess of files and notes scattered across his desk. Well, if anyone can crack it, it's you. Su Ming smirked. Thanks for the vote of confidence. The following morning, Su Ming and Detective Zhao were back in the field, visiting the site of Lin Fei's abduction. The area had already been combed over by forensics, but Su Ming's eyes caught something everyone else had missed. A small, nearly invisible mark etched into the ground near where the boy had been taken. He knelt, running his fingers over the marking. It was a symbol, crude but unmistakable. This wasn't random, Su Ming said, more to himself than to Zhao. They're leaving a message. Detective Zhao crouched beside him, studying the symbol. What does it mean? Su Ming's mind flashed back to his criminal days, to the coded messages and symbols used by underground networks. It's a marker, a sign for the next step in their plan. Zhao looked puzzled. A plan for what? Su Ming stood, his expression grim. A sale. Chapter 30, Cracking the Code. The air in the investigation room was heavy with tension. Su Ming stood in front of the crime board, now filled with a complex web of connections. The children's abductions, the locations, and the mysterious symbol he had uncovered at the last scene. His mind was working furiously, piecing together the clues one by one. Chief Su paced the room, his usually calm demeanor fractured by the growing pressure. We need answers, Su Ming. The media is all over this, and people are terrified. We can't afford to waste any more time. Su Ming glanced at his father, then back at the board. His gaze lingered on the crude symbol etched into the ground. It was a marker, a code left behind by the kidnappers, a sign for whoever was buying the children. But the meaning still eluded him. This symbol, Su Ming said, pointing at it. It's not just random. It's part of a system, a network of communication between criminal organizations. I've seen something like this before. Detective Zhao raised an eyebrow. In your global intel network? Su Ming hesitated for a second, choosing his words carefully. Something like that. He couldn't reveal the full extent of his involvement in the network to anyone, not even his family. The global intelligence community he was part of operated in the shadows, exchanging information between members who sought to protect their identities. Su Ming had joined them for access to invaluable resources and insights, but secrecy was paramount. Chief Su stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. What does it mean? Su Ming tapped the board. It's a signal. It tells us where the next exchange will take place, where they plan to sell the children. It's subtle enough to go unnoticed by anyone not familiar with this world, but clear to those who know how to read it. And where is this exchange happening? Zhao asked. Su Ming paused for a moment, then turned to the map on the wall. His finger traced a line between the abduction sites, then stopped at a location deep in the industrial district of Longshan City. Here. The next move will be here. It's isolated, has no heavy traffic, and is perfect for a secret transaction. Chief Su and Zhao exchanged glances. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead they had. We'll need a team ready to move, Chief Su said, already reaching for his phone. And we'll keep this quiet. No leaks. Su Ming nodded, knowing full well that the operation would have to be flawless. Any mistake could tip off the kidnappers, and they'd disappear again, this time for good. Later that night, Su Ming found himself alone in his room, staring at the computer screen. He had sent a message to his contact in the Intel network, requesting more information on the symbol. They were well connected in the underworld, often feeding him crucial pieces of the puzzle when he was stuck. As he waited for a response, his thoughts drifted. This case had pulled him deeper into the world of crime solving than he had planned. Despite his best efforts to avoid it, he was constantly dragged into these situations. The so-called crime magnet phenomenon seemed to follow him wherever he went, as if fate refused to let him live a quiet life. But Su Ming had always been like this. In his previous life, he had thrived on solving problems and navigating the gray areas of morality with ease. Now, even though he was on the other side of the law, his mind still worked the same way. He saw the mistakes and the loopholes, the subtle details that others missed, and he couldn't help but dive in. His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. The message had arrived. Got your request. The symbol is tied to an underground auction group. They deal in specialized goods. You're looking at human trafficking, my friend. Be careful. Su Ming's expression hardened. He had suspected as much, but seeing it confirmed hit harder than expected. This wasn't just a series of random kidnappings. This was organized, calculated, and designed to make children disappear without a trace. A knock on his door pulled him away from the screen. His sick sister, Su Ming, the artist, walked in. She looked concerned but tried to hide it behind a casual smile. "I heard about the case," she said softly. "I know you're working hard. Just don't forget to take care of yourself." "Okay." Su Ming nodded, giving her a small smile. "I will." Su Ming sighed, crossing her arms. "You've always had this weird ability to attract trouble, you know? Even when we were kids, it was like you couldn't walk 5 minutes without stumbling into something dangerous. Maybe it's just bad luck," Su Ming joked. "Or maybe it's because you're too smart for your own good," Su Ming countered, her voice gentle. "You always find a way to get involved whether you want to or not." Su Ming leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of her words. "Maybe, but I have to see this through." Su Ming nodded, understanding but still worried. "Just don't lose yourself in it, okay? You're still my little brother, no matter how many cases you solve." After she left, Su Ming returned to his work. The plan was starting to come together, and he knew the next few days would be crucial. There was no room for error. If they moved too soon, the traffickers would vanish. If they waited too long, the children might never be seen again. The next day, Su Ming, Detective Zhao, and the Special Task Force gathered at a rundown warehouse in the industrial district. It was the perfect place for an illegal exchange, secluded, abandoned, and easy to disappear from. Su Ming watched from the shadows, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The team had set up surveillance and was waiting for the traffickers to arrive. Every second felt like an eternity. Then a car pulled up. 2 men stepped out, followed by another figure, a child. It was Lin Fei. Su Ming's heart raced. They were here. He signaled to the task force, and they moved in swiftly, surrounding the area in a coordinated strike. Within minutes, the traffickers were subdued, and Lin Fei was safe. As Su Ming watched the operation unfold, a sense of relief washed over him. They had done it, but he knew this was only the beginning. The symbol, the auction group, it all pointed to something much larger, something that would take him deeper into the criminal underworld than he had anticipated. And despite his desire for a quiet, lazy life, Su Ming knew he couldn't walk away from it now.